Have you ever stopped to think how a simple glance can change everything? At first, it seemed like just another ordinary day. The sun was shining, the house was calm, and all she wanted was a little peace. But in a second, something unexpected happened. She felt her stepson's eyes on her, intense, challenging, and filled with something she couldn't name. She tried to ignore it, but she knew that wasn't normal. And what happened next? Something unthinkable, something she never imagined would cross her mind, not even in her worst nightmares. Betrayal, infidelity, and a forbidden love were about to unfold. How so? Would she be able to resist? Or would she succumb to desire? Do you want to know what happened? I guarantee this story will turn your head upside down. Because deep down, the truth is that sometimes the greatest mistakes start with a simple glance. If you're curious to find out more, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, share it with your friends, and turn on the notification bell. That way, you won't miss any details of this story, and will stay up to date with everything. It was supposed to be just another ordinary day, but life has a funny way of turning everything upside down when you least expect it. She was alone at home, busy with her usual tasks, when she felt something different in the air, a persistent gaze that sent a silent shiver across her skin. She instinctively turned around, and there he was, Tyler, her stepson, standing in the doorway, his eyes fixed on her with an intensity she couldn't ignore. It wasn't a casual look, it wasn't innocent, and it was far from the gaze one expects from a family member. It threw her off for a second, but she quickly pushed the thought aside. Maybe it was just her imagination, or maybe not. From that moment on, something subtle, yet profound, changed in the atmosphere. It wasn't a lost glance or a senseless daydream. There was something in Tyler's posture, in the way he held the eye contact, that carried a different weight. It wasn't the look of a son to a stepmother, and she knew that. She tried to look away, mentally change the subject, and continue her routine as if nothing had happened. But some things simply cannot be undone. They cannot be ignored. Once perception sets in, there's no going back to the way things were. She tried to forget, tried to convince herself it was just a meaningless moment, but an unease lingered there, latent. Sometimes, small details go unnoticed until, suddenly, everything makes sense. Maybe it was the way he held her gaze for too long. Or maybe it was the way his presence seemed to take up more space than it should have. She had heard stories of infidelity, tales of betrayal that started exactly like this. With a glance, an instant, a moment that seemed insignificant, but was hiding something much bigger. The truth is that some paths begin to be drawn without us realizing it, and by the time we notice, we're already too far down the road to turn back. That night's dinner carried a silent tension, as if something invisible hung in the air between them. Tyler watched her in a way that made her skin tingle, as if he was trying to decipher every detail of her. She tried to ignore it, pretend nothing was different, but it was impossible. Every time she lifted her gaze, there were his eyes, attentive, analyzing her with an interest that didn't fit the relationship they were supposed to have. This wasn't in her head. There was a dangerous game forming, and the worst part was that she knew it, but couldn't step off the board. Later, when she was in her room, trying to forget that persistent gaze, she heard a knock at the door. Her heart raced, and for a moment, she hesitated. She opened the door just enough to see him standing there, nervous but determined. The way he looked at her left no doubt that there was something unspoken between them. The words coming from his mouth seemed normal, trivial, but the subtext screamed. She could feel the line being drawn in the sand. She knew she shouldn't cross it. But then, why didn't she close the door immediately? The silence between them was almost deafening. She knew this type of infidelity story always began with small moments like this. Seemingly innocent conversations, prolonged glances, hesitations that said more than any word. Nothing had happened yet, but something inside her told her that this was far from the end. And if there was a point of no return, it was getting further and further away. After all, some decisions don't happen all at once. They sneak in slowly until the inevitable becomes reality. The dawn brought light, but it didn't dissipate the tension. Breakfast was silent, each one lost in their own thoughts. But Tyler didn't want to leave anything in the air. He broke the silence directly, asking about her insomnia. The question caught her off guard. Did he know she had spent the whole night tossing and turning in bed, haunted by what wasn't said? His tone wasn't accusatory, but there was something there, a subtle provocation. As if he was testing her, waiting to see if she would admit what they both already knew. She tried to dodge it, keep control, act as if everything was just one big coincidence. But the problem with ignoring a fire is that the flames don't disappear just because you pretend not to see them. And then he moved closer, reducing the distance between them until she could feel his breath. Everything in her screamed to keep the boundaries intact, to take a step back and end this before it was too late. But the moment she felt the heat of his closeness, she hesitated. And sometimes, a second of hesitation is all it takes to change an entire story. The universe, however, seems to have an ironic way of interfering at just the right or wrong moment. Before anything could be said or done, the familiar sound of a door opening echoed through the house. Her husband had returned earlier than expected. The impact of reality was immediate, and she stepped back at once. Tyler also retreated, but something lingered in the air, an unspoken secret, an unfulfilled attraction, an interrupted moment that could have changed everything. And the worst part? The interruption didn't erase what had happened. It only postponed the inevitable. The following days became a silent game of escape and pursuit. She avoided Tyler at all costs, trying to act as if nothing had happened. But the problem with pretending something doesn't exist is that it only gives it more power. Every time their eyes met, the tension became palpable, almost suffocating. Her husband, on the other hand, seemed oblivious to everything, blindly trusting the stability of their home. Little did he know that his wife was carrying a secret growing inside her like a slow poison, eroding the certainties she once had. Tyler, however, was not willing to be ignored. He found his chance in the kitchen, a small space too tight for so much discomfort. Trapped between the sink and the intensity of his gaze, she tried once more to impose a barrier. "This has to stop," she said, but her own voice didn't sound convincing. He crossed his arms, unmoving, his eyes never leaving hers. "Does it have to?" he challenged. The truth was, if she really wanted to, all it would take was a step away, a definitive cut. But why, then, didn't her legs obey? The silence that followed was more revealing than any words. There was no need for confessions, no need for elaborate speeches. What existed between them was already there, stamped in every averted gaze, in every suppressed sigh. And that was the most dangerous part. It wasn't just a passing impulse, it wasn't a meaningless daydream. It was something real, something she should have never allowed to grow. But now, denying it seemed as absurd as admitting it. And deep down, she already knew, the problem was never resisting Tyler. The problem was wanting to resist and not being able to. The house seemed bigger with her husband gone. A different silence settled in. Not the one of peace, but the one of anticipation. Every corner seemed charged with a new energy, as if the walls knew what was about to happen. Tyler didn't need to say anything. The way he looked at her, his posture relaxed yet tense, revealed that he was waiting for her to give in, waiting for the mask of denial to finally fall. And maybe, deep down, she knew that the resistance was now just a formality. This time, it was him who broke the silence. His voice firm, but without aggression. "You can keep pretending this doesn't exist, but I won't." It was a direct attack, no beating around the bush, and she felt the impact. How could she argue with such an obvious truth? Her lips opened to protest, to reject the accusation, but her voice failed her. Because he was right. Everything inside her screamed that running away was the only sensible choice, but standing there, feeling his proximity, was like standing on the edge of a cliff, knowing the fall would be inevitable. She wanted to believe she was still in control, that she could simply turn her back and go on with her life as if nothing had happened. But it wasn't that simple. Not when her body was already responding before her mind even processed it. Tyler didn't press. He just watched, waited, letting her decide. But there was something in his gaze, a mixture of patience and certainty. As if he knew that, in the end, it wouldn't be him who would take the next step. It would be her. The air between them felt electrified, charged with a tension that required no words. Tyler was there, waiting. He didn't impose anything, didn't move beyond what was necessary. He simply waited for the truth she was still fighting to suppress. "Tell me this doesn't mean anything," he challenged, his voice low but firm. She wanted to, needed to say it. But how could she deny something already burning inside her? The problem was never just the attraction. It was what that attraction represented. The collapse of a life that once seemed unquestionable. Her hesitation was the answer Tyler was looking for. He took a step back, his eyes still locked on hers, but his expression lighter, almost resigned. "If that's what you want, I'll forget. I'll never bring it up again." But the offer sounded more like a test than a concession. He knew, and she knew too, if she really wanted it all to end right there, all it would take was a single affirmation. A simple yes would close everything. But her silence was as loud as a scream. When he finally turned to leave, something inside her twisted in panic. It wasn't relief she felt, but an uncomfortable tightness, as if she were losing something she should never have desired. The truth was bitter, almost cruel. The thing that scared her wasn't the risk of getting caught, but the possibility of never feeling that again. The knot in her throat betrayed that the choice had already been made, even if she didn't have the courage to admit it out loud. The tension became unbearable. Tyler could no longer stand the averted glances, the short responses, the way she tried to pretend nothing had happened. "You're avoiding me," he accused, crossing his arms, his gaze fixed on hers. She denied it quickly, but her voice didn't carry conviction. How could it? Her mind spun, trying to keep up appearances, but her body betrayed her. The weight of that attraction was becoming unbearable, a dangerous game where, deep down, they both already knew who would win. He approached slowly, calculated, as if challenging the last barrier between them. "Then look me in the eyes and tell me you feel nothing." His voice came out almost as a whisper, but the impact was brutal. Her heart raced. Every fiber of her being screamed to run, but her legs wouldn't move. Because deep down, running meant admitting. And admitting meant losing herself completely. Her body could lie, but her silence spoke for itself. She knew she needed to pull back. Say something, anything, to put an end to this madness. But then, one detail betrayed her. A short sigh, almost imperceptible, but enough for Tyler to notice. His eyes gleamed, as if confirming what he had known all along. And there she was, trapped in a maze of guilt and desire, with no way out in sight. But deep down, did she really want to find one? Tyler wasn't willing to leave things hanging. He wouldn't accept the facade of distance anymore. "You never wanted distance. You never really wanted this," he said with unshakable confidence. Every word carried the certainty that he knew, that he felt what she was trying to ignore. The silence between them, so heavy with what was left unsaid, became deafening. She wanted to react, to deny once more, but the truth was hard to ignore. What they shared wasn't just a mistake, it was something deep, something impossible to erase. Those words, simple and direct, cut like a sharp blade. It was what she feared most, not being able to hide what was right there, visible to all, but still disguised under the weight of silence. How could she deny the obvious? How could she lie to herself, telling herself it didn't matter? Whatever was happening between her and Tyler was no longer a matter of right or wrong, but of desire, of an impulse she no longer had the strength to contain. She wanted to respond, to retort, but the words felt empty in the face of the reality he was forcing her to confront. And perhaps what scared her most wasn't the fact that she was giving in to what she felt, but the sensation that, somewhere deep down, she had always known this would happen. She was standing on the edge of an abyss, and there was no turning back. The path ahead had already been laid out, and the only thing left was to decide whether she would take the next step. The decisive moment had come. Tyler approached her once again, but this time, there were no more doubts in his eyes. "Here's the last chance," he said, with a calmness that made her heart beat faster. He was offering a choice, but the truth was, she already knew what the answer would be. The distance between them seemed to disappear, and the space that remained was no longer physical, but emotional. The last barrier, the final trace of self-control, melted away. She looked at him, her eyes reflecting the internal conflict that consumed her. But what she didn't realize, or perhaps didn't want to realize, was that in those words from Tyler, he wasn't just challenging her. He was showing her that there was no turning back. They had already crossed the line, maybe without realizing it, maybe without meaning to, but the fact was, that line no longer existed. The choice to resist or give in was now irrelevant, because what they shared was already an irrefutable reality. He didn't wait any longer. Without a sudden move, but with absolute certainty, the distance between them disappeared once and for all. There was no denying it anymore. What remained now was understanding that by taking this step, their lives would change forever. It wasn't just about desire or attraction. It was about something deeper, something that transcended the moment. And despite the confusion, the guilt, and the fear, she didn't step back. The next step was taken, and the line no longer existed. What began as a moment of vulnerability had transformed into something irreversible. The days began to blend with the nights, and what once seemed like a fleeting mistake was now a silent, yet intense routine. Every exchange of glances, every subtle gesture, carried the weight of a decision she no longer knew how to separate from herself. Her relationship with Tyler had become a reality she could no longer avoid, and perhaps didn't even want to. The inner dilemma that once consumed her now seemed to be replaced by a desire that could no longer be contained. She knew that what she was doing was wrong, but the feeling of being alive, of being desired in such an intense way, erased any trace of regret. She wasn't just surrendering to momentary pleasure anymore. She was losing herself in something that was both liberating and destructive. What she felt for Tyler wasn't just attraction. It was a need that came from a deeper, almost primal place. And then, when the reality of her normal life, the marriage, the routine, crept closer, she felt a sense of panic. Her husband, completely unaware, was what she should be protecting, but what she was really protecting was the secret she now shared with Tyler. The space between guilt and desire was getting narrower, as if they were merging into a single experience she could no longer control. The price of her choice was high, but the reward, at least for now, seemed worth the risk. The weight of the guilt she thought she would feel didn't come in the way she expected. In fact, the guilt was a distant shadow, often overshadowed by the desire that now dominated her thoughts. When Tyler noticed something was still bothering her, he asked, "Do you regret it?" She should have said yes. The answer should have been simple, a defense mechanism against the harsh reality of what they were doing. But it wasn't. She simply looked at him, wordless, and everything he needed to know was there, in her silence. The truth was, regret never came. And that scared her more than anything. It wasn't the first time she knew what was right and wrong, but now, for the first time, she didn't feel convinced that the line between the two was so clear. It was almost as if she were reliving a version of herself she didn't recognize, a woman who didn't just desire, but needed it. The shock came not from the pleasure itself, but from the absence of remorse. Tyler, for his part, was perceptive enough to see what was going on in her mind. He didn't push, but the uncertainty was in the air. They both knew they were flirting with something bigger than the two of them, and there was no going back. They looked at each other, but words were unnecessary. What was happening between them was something much deeper and more complicated than simple desire. It was an emotional connection that had an unforeseen intensity, and as much as she wanted to resist, she knew she couldn't. Some decisions can't be undone. What started as an impulsive choice had now become a permanent mark on her life. Every thought, every touch, every glance shared with Tyler was etched in her mind indelibly. She could try to push him away, try to deny what she was feeling, but the truth was clear. There was no going back to what it was before. And perhaps somewhere deep down, she had known this from the beginning, but the fear of facing this reality had kept her from seeing it. As the days passed, the weight of her actions became more present. But there was something else, a sense that this was now a part of her, like a lost piece that she had finally found. The guilt didn't dominate her the way she had imagined, but the awareness that her life would never be the same began to take shape. It was impossible to ignore that she had crossed a line with no return, and from that moment on, her journey would follow a path of unknown consequences. And looking back, she knew the choice was hers. No one else could be held responsible for what was happening. She could have stopped, could have avoided it, but at some point, she let herself be carried away. The fear of losing what had already been built with her husband, the concern about the consequences, were no longer as strong as the desire to move forward. She knew there was no turning back, but she wasn't sure she wanted to. So, what would you do if you were in this stepmother's place? The temptation, the desire, and finally, the decision to not turn back. Every choice carries its consequences, and as we've seen, some cannot be undone. Now it's your turn to reflect on the paths you choose to follow in life. The most difficult situations can teach us a lot, but only those who have the courage to act and learn from their mistakes can truly change their story. And you, do you have the courage to take control of your life and your decisions? Don't forget to share your thoughts in the comments below. If you liked this content, give it a thumbs up, share it with your friends, and of course, subscribe to the channel to keep following stories and lessons like this one. Turn on the bell so you never miss a video and stay one step ahead. See you next time.